So this week's Parsha, what's that?
My father's yard site
ended today, so we'll learn in memory of your father's yard site, in memory of Ricky's father, I believe, and
then next week is my mother.
Next week's your mother, and in memory of Harvey Yellen, who's a beloved member of our shul who just passed away. So let's get started. This week's Parsha is Parshas Chukas. It begins on page 893 in the ArtScroll Stone Chumash. It's Bamidbar chapter 19. And it's the law, it begins with the law of the red cow. Hashem spoke to Moshe and Aaron, saying, "This is the decree of the Torah which Hashem has commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and they shall take to you a completely red cow which is without blemish, and upon which a yoke has not come. And what do you do with it?"
839, not 8.
I said 893? Right, I'm sorry, 839, page 839. "You shall give it to Aaron, to Elazar the Kohen. He shall take it to the outside of the camp, and someone shall slaughter it in his presence. Elazar the Kohen shall take some of its blood with his forefinger and sprinkle some of its blood towards the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. Someone shall burn the cow before his eyes, its hide, its flesh, its blood, with its dung. Shall he burn it?" Usually they they clean out the insides before they throw it on the altar. Here, everything was burned, not on the altar, as I'll discuss in a minute. "The Kohen shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson thread, and he shall throw them into the burning of the cow." And that's the process. They burn the entire cow. So this isn't really an offering per se. So usually the way that offerings were brought, your typical offering, let's say a burnt offering, would be that it would be slaughtered in the courtyard of the tabernacle or the Beis HaMikdash of the temple, whichever it may be. And it was slaughtered. They had a butchering area where it would be skinned. It would be cut into its parts, into like the different cuts of meat. And then they would be brought, they would sprinkle the blood. They would catch the blood when they slaughtered it, and they in a cup, and they would bring that cup and sprinkle the blood on the altar in the courtyard of the tabernacle or temple. And then they would bring the pieces that were burnt up to the top of the altar and burn them there. That's your typical offering. That's not what happened with this red cow. Instead, it wasn't even slaughtered in the tabernacle. It was, they took it outside the tent. Outside the camp. They slaughter it outside there and just sprinkle the blood in the same direction, in the direction of the tent of meeting 7 times, but it's not actually on the altar. And it was burnt also there outside the camp. It wasn't even burnt in the vicinity of the Mishkan of the tabernacle. So this really wasn't an offering, and they actually make some connections to offerings to learn some halachas, some of the rules, but this wasn't an offering. And it's introduced in the Parsha as this is the decree of the Torah. The Hebrew word for decree is chukas, which is usually understood as a law that we don't understand. For example, the Rambam, Maimonides, says about the different prohibited relations. That, for example, the incestual relations and homosexual relations and things of that nature, that those are, he says, they're chukim. They're laws of the Torah that we don't necessarily understand the reason. And that's the introduction, but the Torah doesn't actually say that explicitly there, but it does say it here in regards to the laws of the red cow. And the commentaries in general say that from these rules, from these laws, that we have no understanding what is burning a red cow and taking some of the ashes and sprinkling it on someone who's ritually impure. How does that make them pure? Especially the big question here is that the person, the Kohen who's involved in the processing of the ashes of the red cow, becomes ritually impure, but it purifies someone who's already ritually impure. So that itself is kind of a contradiction that we don't have resolved. Not that there isn't a real resolution, but it's not understandable to human beings. It's something that is, it's something of a spiritual nature that we in the physical world can't understand. But that does tell us that the same way that these rules we can't understand, even the laws of the Torah that sound understandable, for example, do not steal. That, makes a lot of sense to us. We understand the nature of personal property, and that if a person steals from another person, that hurts the other person, and it kind of erodes the whole foundations of civilization, which is that I respect you and your property, and you respect me and my property. When that idea doesn't exist anymore, so then civilization doesn't exist anymore. People can't live together in peace. But we have to understand that when there's a mitzvah in the Torah, there's much more to it than that. It's not just what we could comprehend, but there's spiritual meanings behind the mitzvahs that are beyond us, the same way that there are meanings beyond this mitzvah of the red cow. Okay, so what do they do with it now? So in verse 7, so they burn it to a crisp. And in verse 7, the Kohen shall immerse his clothing and immerse himself in water. That means he dips in the mikveh, and afterwards he may enter the camp. And the Kohen shall remain contaminated until evening. The one who burns it shall immerse his clothing in water, immerse himself in water, and shall remain contaminated until evening. On page 841, again, ritually impure. And in verse 9, a pure man, person who's ritually pure, shall gather the ash of the cow and place it outside the camp in a pure place, for the assembly of Israel shall remain as a safekeeping for water of sprinkling and as for purification. The one who gathers the ashes of the cow shall immerse his clothing and remain contaminated until evening, and it shall be for the children of Israel and for the proselyte who dwells among them as an eternal decree. So that's the rule. So they put it in a safe place, and they use it for sprinkling. So how do they use it for sprinkling? They take the ashes, put a small amount in water. As long as there's a minimal amount of ashes in the water, it doesn't matter how much. And they sprinkle that water on the person who's ritually impure through contact with the dead, and only that form of ritual impurification, that form of tumah. And they do it on, as we'll see, on the third day, and we'll get into where it actually describes how they when they do it, but that leads to the ritual purification. And our sages say that in all of history, there have only been 9 of these paradumas, of these red cows, that were processed. And because they only needed a small amount of ashes to purify people, so a little bit went a long way. And in fact, this one that they made at this point, that Moshe made, actually lasted until the time of Ezra, who was in the second Beis HaMikdash, and the
Must be like an
yeah, that's outside. Yeah, in the that's not the shul alarm. That's what I was making sure. Okay, that that it actually lasted till the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash, the second temple, which was just spitballing. It's about 700, upper 700 years from this point, probably close to 800 years. That's below. I think it's somewhere around 850 years from this point in time. So a little bit went a long way, at least at this point. Later, they might have lasted less, but there were a total of 9 in history. Okay, so continuing on. So in verse 11 on page 841, we have the laws of tumas mace, of impurity through contact with the dead. And the basic idea is that anyone who touches a corpse or something, some things that are equal to a corpse, becomes ritually impure. And even someone, in verse 14 on page 841, this is the teaching regarding a man who should die in a tent. Anything that enters the tent and anything that is in the tent shall be contaminated for a 7-day period. That means that anyone who's under the same roof as a corpse also becomes ritually impure. And a roof is defined as something above him, that there's a space at least of 1 tefach, which is some 3-4 inches. And it has to be the 1 tefach, at least 1 tefach by 1 tefach space.
Here's a question, real quick. Given that, Rabbi Yellen,
yeah,
big person in our synagogue passed, Heva Kadisha.
Yeah.
Are they contaminated when they are sitting there waiting, sitting there with the body?
Yes,
so
they are.
Whoever is doing that.
Yes, whoever is doing that is ritually contaminated. And in the time of the Beis HaMikdash of the temple, they would have to go through this process before coming in contact with any truma, let's say, or any kachim, any offerings. To go into the Beis HaMikdash, to go into the temple, they need to go through this process for going in. So now, because we're all assumed to be ritually impure, because we have no way, we don't have the ashes of the red cows, we have no way of purifying ourselves. Right. So that does have halachic ramifications. For example, we can't bring up Korban Pesach. Well, that's actually questionable. Let me leave that behind. There are certain areas of the Temple Mount we wouldn't be allowed to go into, right, because we're ritually impure, and we can't go into certain areas of the Temple Mount as a result of that. We let's say our challah, when we separate, when we make a dough, So there's a mitzvah to separate some of that and give it to the Kohen. We don't give it to the Kohen, first of all, because we don't have a strong tradition of who's actually a Kohen, but also since we're all assumed to be ritually impure, so that whatever we touch of the challah becomes ritually impure also. So it can't be eaten because it's something holy that's ritually impure, and that's why we burn it.
One last quick question. Yesterday when we left, so there was such a lineup of cars. And both Jan and myself had a water bottle in the car. So we said, get it. She said, as long as we wash ourselves before we enter our house, we dump the water, we're okay. Is that correct?
I'm not sure exactly the details of washing our hands when we leave the cemetery because it doesn't remove the ritual impurity of the cemetery. I don't know the details, but I don't think there's a prohibition of drinking water that was in the cemetery. Right. But also technically, Right.
And that was the reasoning why, we'll just dump the water on ourselves.
Right. That's that itself is, I'm not sure exactly the halacha of eating and drinking in a cemetery, but at some point it's dangerous. And when it's dangerous, when, over here it could be 100, hot and humid like it was. So if somebody's feeling faint or whatever, they could definitely drink to revive them. So it could be dangerous to not drink. But he was right. But
when we entered our house, we did it on.
Right. Yeah, so that's something that people do. But the same way that being under a roof along with the corpse makes one impure, but there's also such a thing as protecting yourself from that impurity. And that's if you have a space of a tefach, which is once again, like 3-4 inches in between with a shelter there. So then you're safe. So if someone's in a car, let's say, technically the car will interrupt between them. The issue is that the trees themselves are considered tents because the branches of the trees are too big. But if we're inside a car and the car is completely closed, so that itself would shelter us from the impurity. So, and for that reason, there's sometimes I know that recently, actually, that there was a family of Kohanim that went. So if it's their close family for like a father, mother, etc., we've learned back in what was it in Parshas Emor that they are allowed and are supposed to go to the funeral and to take care of the burial. But if it's not the burial, so let's say for an unveiling, they would not allow, a Kohen's not allowed to make themselves ritually impure through contact with the dead. So they would not be allowed in the cemetery on the gravesite during an unveiling, let's say. But the burial of this Kohen's family was close to the road, and there were no trees that overhung the graves and the road at that point. So they were able to stay inside the car, drive to the gravesite and just stay on the side and not go right on top of the grave. And then they were safe. Once again, if this is an issue for someone, they should consult a competent halachic authority, because I don't know the details of the practical halacha in regards to this, but that's a basic idea of what they'd have to do. Okay, so what did they do to make someone pure? So in verse 17, on page 841, they shall take for the contaminated person some of the ashes of the burning of the purification animal and put it upon spring water in a vessel. And a pure man shall take hyssop and dip it in the water and sprinkle upon the tent, all the vessels, the people that were there, upon the one who touched the bone, etc. And the pure person shall sprinkle upon the contaminated person on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and purify him on the 7th day. He shall immerse his clothing, immerse himself in water, and become purified in the evening. So the process is that he has to wait till 3 days after he becomes impure, then be sprinkled with these water mixed with the ashes of the red cow, and then again on the 7th day, and then not 7 days from the 3rd day, but he counts 1, 2, 3, sprinkled on that day, 4, 5, 6, 7, sprinkled on that day, dips in the mikvah, and that evening he's pure again. And that's how someone would become ritually pure from contact with the dead. Okay. Let's see. Okay, and so now on page 843, chapter 20, we have the death of Miriam. So the children on page 843, once again, chapter 20, the children of Israel, the whole assembly arrived at the wilderness of Sin in the 1st month, and the people settled in Kadesh. Miriam died there, and she was buried there. There was no water for the assembly, and they gathered against Moshe and Aaron. The people quarreled with Moshe and spoke up, saying, "If only we had perished as our brethren perished before before Hashem? Why have you brought etc.? They complain, you brought us to a place with no water. And I say that this first happened with the death of Miriam because they had the well of Miriam. They had a rock actually that we've seen earlier in the Torah that was that water flowed from this rock, and that was in the merit of Miriam, of the righteousness of Miriam. And when Miriam died, it dried up, it stopped flowing. And as a result of this, people recognized that all this was as a result of Miriam. And now they're complaining against Moshe and Aaron that you brought us into this place and there's nothing to drink. And it says, Moshe and Aaron went from the presence of the congregation to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. And Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, in verse 8, take the staff and gather together the assembly, you and Aaron your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes that it shall give its water. It shall bring forth for them water from the rock and give drink to the assembly and to their animals. And in verse 9 on page 845, Moshe took the staff from before Hashem as he had commanded him. Moshe and Aaron gathered the congregation before the rock, and he said to them, listen now, O rebels, shall we bring forth water from you from this rock? Then Moshe raised his arm and struck the rock with his staff twice. Abundant water came forth, and the assembly and their animals drank. Okay, sounds great, right? He did this miracle, and water started flowing from the rock. In verse 12, Hashem said to Moshe and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you will not bring this congregation to the land that I have given them. There are the waters of strife where the children of Israel contended with Hashem, and he was sanctified through them. Okay, so now what did they do wrong? What did Moshe do wrong here? So Rashi says that he struck the rock. Or as Hashem said, you're supposed to speak to the rock. And that's what he said wrong. The Ramban disagrees with that pretty vehemently. And the Ramban says Hashem told Moshe to take his staff. What's he taking his staff for if not to hit the rock with it? So, okay, and just about all the commentaries all have their each approaches. I saw, I brought down that Abarbanel has like 10 different approaches. So we're a little bit limited in time, so I'll go with one approach, and that is the Klei Yakar. And so the Klei Yakar says that if you look at the terminology, it says in verse 8 on page 843, take the staff. It doesn't say take your staff. It says take the staff. It's like a staff that we've discussed. Take it. It's the Hebrew, the expression they use is the hey hayidiyah. That the hey at the beginning means something that we know about, a known quantity. This staff. What's the staff?
It's the one you.
So that's not how the Klei Yakar understands. The Klei Yakar understands that it's a reference to the end of last week's Parsha, Parshas Korach, where it says that they took a staff for Aaron and a staff for all the other tribes. So Aaron's staff for the tribe of Levi, and a staff for each of the other tribes, and put it in the Kodesh Kadosh and put it in the Holy of Holies. And the next morning, the staff that was written that it was for Aaron, so it had sprouted twigs and leaves and almonds were growing from it. And that's the staff. The staff means that staff of Aaron. And what was the meaning of this? So it was supposed to tell them that this staff of Aaron, look at this. This is a dry piece of wood. It's a staff. It's just like a cane. It's not alive. It's dead, dry wood. But look what happened when you connect it to Aaron, and it's connected to this holy person Aaron. So it becomes moist again and becomes alive again, and things start growing from it. So what they were supposed to do was show this to the Jewish people and say, look, Hashem could bring moisture and water and life out of a dry stick of wood. Hashem could bring water out of a rock, and this was supposed to inspire their faith in Hashem. And that was the speaking to the rock that Moshe was supposed to do. He was supposed to speak to the rock and tell it, look, just like this staff listened to the command of Hashem and a dry piece of wood brought forth this life, so too you, rock, should bring forth water, because that's the will of Hashem. But instead he hit the rock, and that was his mistake. And that hit, and he hit the rock, and when he hit the rock, but if you look in verse 11, it says, then Moshe raised his arm and struck the rock with his staff. When he struck the rock, it says that he struck it with his staff, not with that staff of Aaron. He struck it with his own staff. And this staff, people had this memory, and we're already holding towards the end of their time in the desert. I forgot to mention that. We're holding towards the end of their time in the desert, and the people didn't really remember the time in Egypt. And these were people who were younger than 20 when they left Egypt. They wouldn't necessarily have remembered that. And that's definitely not the crossing of the sea. And they heard rumors of, or they remembered faintly about the staff of Moshe that he performed these great wonders with. So when Moshe hit the rock with his staff, in people's minds, that was this magic staff that we heard about that did all those wonders in Egypt. Look, it's doing this too. And they didn't view this miracle in regards to Hashem, and it didn't increase the faith in Hashem the way it should have. And that was his mistake. Okay, that's one approach. That's the approach of the Klei Yakar. He also deals with the language that he uses here and the language that he uses with the staff at the splitting of the sea. But for all that are interested, we could talk about it some other time. Okay, so now on page 847, Moshe sent emissaries to the king of Edom and said, let us pass through your land. And the king of Edom refused. So they actually went around the territory of Edom. And the reason for this is that we were commanded later in Devarim, it says that we were commanded not to bother Edom. The Edom are descendants of Esav, and he honored our patriarch Yitzchak. Esav was very particular in honoring his father, our patriarch Yitzchak. So we were commanded not to fight against his descendants. So we asked permission to go through their territory. They refused, so we went around. Then they came to Har HaHar, and there Aaron died. And so there Aaron died. Our sages say that Moshe brought him up to the mountain, and as it's described here, and had him stretch out on a bed, and essentially he stretched out on the bed and just passed away in a peaceful state. Okay, so now on page 849, chapter 21. And in verse 29, 849, verse 29, when the entire assembly saw that Aaron had perished, they wept for Aaron 30 days, the entire house of Israel. And this teaches us how to mourn. This is the source that we mourn for our dead for 30 days. Okay, so verse 21, Amalek attacked. So chapter 21, on page 849. The Canaanite king of Arad, who dwelled in the south, heard that Israel had come by the route of the spies, and he warned against Israel and took a captive from it. Israel made a vow to Hashem and says, if you deliver this people into my hand, I'll consecrate their cities. Hashem heard the voice of Israel. He delivered the Canaanite and consecrated them in their cities and named the place Karma. Okay, and our sages say that they got the ability to attack, or the courage to attack, because the clouds of glory that the Jewish people were surrounded by throughout their time in the desert had left them with the death of Aaron. And again, the same way that they lost the spring of Miriam when Miriam died, so the clouds that surrounded them and protected them were gone once Aaron died, and they saw that those were there in the merit of Aaron. Okay, so then they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Sea of Reeds. This is verse 4 on page 849, to go around the land of Edom, and the spirit of the people grew short by the way. And they spoke against Hashem and against Moshe. Why do you bring us from Egypt to die in this wilderness? There's no food and no water. Our soul is disgusted with the insubstantial food, with the manna. So first of all, it says that they grew short on the way, that they grew short of temper on the way. The Baal Turim says that what was happening is that they were passing by the territory of Edom, of Esav. And they, on such a high spiritual level, were able to sense the galus, the exile, and all the suffering that the Esav will cause to their descendants throughout our history in this final exile, with the exile of Rome, when the Rome destroyed the temple and we went into Rome, which is the father of Western civilization, and all that we have suffered there by the descendants of Edom. And that caused them a lot of pain. Okay, and then they complain against the man because it's so insubstantial. Rashi says that the man was a perfect food with absolutely no waste, and it sustained them and nothing more. So there was no waste, and the people were saying that a person, you can't keep on eating without ever eliminating it, and this is going to catch up to us. And that was their complaint. So Hashem, in verse 6 on page 851, Hashem sent the fiery servants against the people, and they bit the people. A large multitude of Israel died, that they were attacked by poisonous snakes. The people came to Moshe and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against Hashem and against you. Pray to Hashem that he remove from us the serpent. And Moshe prayed for the people. Hashem said to Moshe, make for yourself a fiery serpent, place it on a pole. It will be that anyone who is bitten will look at it and live. And that's what Moshe did. Moshe made a serpent of copper, placed it on the pole. So it was that if the serpent bit a man, he would stare at the copper serpent and live. And the commentators say, the Ramban says that the meaning of this, not that there was any spiritual power to the serpent, but It was when they looked at, the Mishnah says, when they looked at the snake, they looked upwards. He put it on a pole, so they would look upwards and they would look past it at heaven and remember to pray to Hashem. And the Ramban says that usually when a person is hurt by something, let's say he's bitten by a snake, looking at the snake just makes things worse. Looking at a snake makes things worse. It causes him more anxiety and it reminds him of the bite, and that you usually want to distract them, keep that away from them. If a person's bitten by a dog, you want to keep them away from dogs, not have a dog right there in front of them. But here, Hashem was showing them this is purely miraculous. This wasn't like a natural healing. Okay. Then it says in verse 12, they journeyed and encamped in the valley of Zered. From there, they journeyed and encamped on the other side of Arnon, in the wilderness, it's just out from the border of the Amorite. For the Arnon is the border of Moab, between Moab and the Amorite. Therefore, it says in the books of the wars of Hashem, the gift of the sea of reeds and the rivers of Arnon, the outpouring of the rivers when it veered to dwell at Ar and lead against the border of Moab. And from there to the well, it is the well of which Hashem said to Moshe, assemble the people and I shall give them water. Then Israel on page 853, verse 18, sang the song, come up, O well, call out to it, the well that the princes dug, that the nobles of the people excavated through a lawgiver with their staffs, a gift from the wilderness. The gift went to the valley, from the valley to the heights, from the heights to the valley in the fields of Moab, at the top of the peak, overlooking the surface of the wilderness. And this is one of the songs of the Torah, like we have the song at the splitting of the sea, we have the song at the Hazinu at the end of the Torah, and here we have, this is the song of the well. And our sages say that it says that they said, the gift of the sea of reeds, the rivers of Arnon, the outpouring of the rivers when it veered to dwell at Ar. What's this referring to? So our sages say that in the river of Arnon, that went through a mountain pass, where there were mountains on one side, mountains on the other side. It was like a canyon. And it says that part of the mountain on one side jutted out, and on the other side there were caves that corresponded to where it jutted out on the other side. And the Moabites, or the people here, the locals, I should say, the natives, encamped they gathered in these caves above this canyon. And when the Jewish people were going to pass through, they were going to fall on them and attack them and kill all the Jews passing through. And Hashem caused it that the mountains, actually the two sides of the canyons, came together and crushed all the enemy soldiers who were hiding in the walls of the canyon. And Hashem said that should I destroy the enemies of my sons and not let them know about it? So the rivers of Arnon actually carried the blood and the soldiers, the dead soldiers, into the waters of the well of Miriam, and that brought them to the Jewish people so they'd be able to see the miracle that Hashem performed to them and saved them. And it compares the gift of the sea of reeds and the rivers of Arnon in verse 14, that the same way that in the Sea of Reeds, that when the Egyptians were killed in the sea, so the sea spit out the Egyptians onto the dry land so the Jews could see that they were gone, they were dead. So the rivers of Arnon also brought the evidence that their enemy soldiers were killed. And that's what the song was about. Then it concludes with the battle with Sichon, who was an Amorite warlord. They sent emissaries to him to say, let us pass through. So Sichon didn't allow them to pass through. This is on page 853, verse 23. And instead, he brought out all his soldiers from their cities and waged war against the Jews. And we conquered them. And we took their cities and settled in it. This was the first conquest of the land of Israel, which wasn't in the land of Israel proper, but this was the first conquest of the greater land of Israel, which included the land on the other side of the Jordan. And then there's another poem here, there are many interpretations given. We're almost done, so I'll describe it. So on page 855, verse 27, it says that regarding this defeat of, in verse 26, actually, I'll back up a little bit. For Cheshbon, it was the city of Sichon, king of the Amorite, and he had warred against the first king of Moab, took all his land from his control until Arnon. Regarding this, the poets would say, come to Cheshbon, let it be built and established as the city of Sichon. For fire has come forth from Cheshbon, a flame from the city of Sichon. It consumed Ar of Moab, the masters of Arnon's heights. Woe to you, O Moab, you are lost, O people of Chemosh, which was the deity that the Moabites worshipped. He made his sons fugitives, his daughters captives of the kings of the Amorite Sichon. Their sovereignty over Cheshbon was lost. It was removed from Divan. We laid waste to Nophach, which reached up until Mediva. Okay, so this is all very esoteric. The commentaries say that this is brought in the Torah to tell us that this is what people would remember this as territory of Moab. And we were commanded not to bother Moab. Again, Moab was a descendant of Lot, and we were commanded not to attack Moab and Ammon, who were descendants of Lot. So the Torah is telling us that this was actually conquered by Sichon, who was an Amorite king. So even though it was in ancient times territory of Moab, but it was conquered by Sichon, and therefore we were able to conquer it. And this whole poem, actually, the Medrash says that the Sichon, the king of this Amorite king, wasn't able to defeat the Moabites. And he brought in Bilam, who we come into a little later, next week's Parsha. He brought in Bilam to help him and to curse the Moabites, so he'd be able to conquer them. And this poem that they're mentioning is actually the curse. It's a poetic curse that Bilam and Sichon pronounced on the Moabites. Okay, so then they settled in the lands of the Amorite, and then there was another warlord there with Bashan. Og, king of Bashan, went out against him, he and his entire people, to do battle at Edrei. And verse 34, Hashem said to Moshe, do not fear him, for into your hands I have given him his entire people, his land. You shall do to him as you did to Sichon, king of the Amorite, who was in Cheshbon. And why would Moshe be afraid? We were commanded many times. Moshe relayed the mitzvah of Hashem, conquer the nations of the land, don't fear them. So Moshe, the Ramban says that Moshe didn't think that this was part of the conquering of the land. Moshe knew that he wasn't going to enter the land. Yeshua would, as he was told earlier. Yeshua would lead the Jews into the land. Moshe wouldn't be the one to lead them. So Moshe thought this is just part of the journey. It wasn't part of the actual conquest. And it says that Og went against him and they did to do battle at Edrei. That means that instead of going out into the field, they entered this fortified city. So technically, Moshe could have gone around. So that's what he would do. He was saying this isn't part of the mitzvah of conquering the land, and there's no reason to do battle with them. And additionally, our sages say that Og had this additional merit that he was the one who delivered a message to Avram that Lot was captured. So he had this merit in his bank account. So, and that would protect him. So Hashem told him, don't worry. And in verse 35, they smote him, his sons, all his people, until there were no survivors left of him, and they took possession of his land. And the children of Israel journeyed and encamped in the plains of Moab on the bank of the Jordan, opposite Yericho. Okay, shkoyach. Everybody have a great Shabbos. Shkoyach.